Welcome back sa ating channel. Naging mainit nga na usapin sa mundo ng social media. Tila sumabog nga sa gigil si Senador Amy Marcos at pinasibak ang mga traidor, lalo na ang mga pulpolitiko. Dito natin makikita na tila maraming ang traidor sa administrasyon ngayon. Kaya naman linilinis ni Senador Amy Marcos ang mga ito, lahat ng panira sa bansang Pilipinas. Banat pa nga ng isang netizen, Ma'am Amy, I salute you. Dapat lang po nagisingin natin si President Bongbong Marcos tungkol sa problemang mga traidor sa ating mahal na presidente. As your brother, sana po magising na at agam-agam na po napapalikuran ng mga traidor at salot sa administrasyon ni President Bongbong Marcos. Salamat po at maraming nagsasabi na sana magising na hanggat maaga pa si President Bongbong Marcos. Salamat po ng marami. God bless you, Madam Amy. Your family cycle escape all Marcos family like we love your ama, late President Apo Lakay. Salamat po, ma'am. Sariling opinyon, kahit wala yan recep na yan, ang importante, ang kailangan mawala ay ang corruption sa gobyerno at mga smuggler, lalo lang dadami ang mga kurakot ng mga korap na tauhan ng gobyerno. Kung pwede lang, Ma'am Amy, i-guide mo yung kapatid mo habang hindi pa naubos. Tiwala namin sa kanya. Point lang sana, huwag siyang padikta sa babaeng ahas. Huwag niya pagtakpan kagaguhan ng mga araneta. Mga ulupong nagsasalita, kakampi pa lang ng mga magnanakaw. Kalo rin, ikaw na ba ang papalit kay Joma na amo mo? Kamusta naman ang anak mong galit na galit dati sa'yo? Mukhang drama lang yun na ayan, lumalabas na ang katotohanan na talagang palang makakaliwa kayo. Bakit hindi sabihin ni Amy na weak ang lazy talaga ng kapatid niya kung matalino ang leader? Hindi siya magpapaloko sa asawa niya. Happy wife, happy life. Kabalit ng buhay ng lahat ng mga Pilipino at ng Pilipinas. Para nga sa karagdagang impormasyon, panoorin nga natin ang buong detalye. At kung bago ka pa naman sa aking channel, huwag kalimutan i-click ang subscribe button at notification bell para lagi kang updated sa ating mga bagong video. At para sa solid viewers natin dyan, maraming salamat sa walang sawang pagsuporta.
Pro Tempore Lauren Legarda and likewise Senator Amy Marcos are now recognized.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. President and Majority Leader. I'm fully aware of the peculiar situation I am in. This bill having been subject of my own committee, but which I am grateful to the Senate President as well as the Senate President pro tempore for taking over. But in fact, questions remain in my mind as well as they do in many others. And first, I would like to state, quoting the Senate President, that international bodies and organizations such as the ADB, the World Bank, the UNCTAD have recognized the immense value and importance of the RCEP, especially in the post-pandemic recovery. However, it should be observed that the UNCTAD itself, in a research paper by Dr. Nishita, indicated that tariff concessions under the RCEP will result in lower exports by the Philippines, completely the opposite claim by the administration. The study shows that the overall effect of RCEP will be a decrease in Philippine exports by $100 million. In another study by Boston University, Rashmi Banga et al., it was shown that Philippine exports will decline by 0.2% and imports would rise by 0.2% at the very least. Even with the sensitive lists of tariff rate quotas, as mentioned by our colleague in the annexes, by Senator Chis Escudero, the paper estimated that the Philippines' balance of trade in goods will deteriorate by a minimum of 1.1% or a loss of USD 260 million per annum. So it will get quite a bit worse before it gets any better. All these losses, on top of an estimated $58 million in tariff revenue losses annually. Are these figures accurate? Do you have any comment? Because I know the DTI, the DA, and the other economic managers' projections are different.
Well, Your Honor, first of all, good afternoon, Your Honor. Mr. President, I always say the proof in the pudding is in the eating. Diba? All these studies were made prior to RCEP's ratification on all these other countries. But we have seen in the region, Mr. President, I mentioned it yesterday and in my speech last week, exports in RCEP countries increased, particularly Vietnam, 16.4% with a total value of $108 billion. Nag-increase. And you know, we're trying to catch up with Vietnam because parang Vietnam is now our peg when we try to get foreign direct investments from other countries. It's always either the Vietnam or Philippines ang gusto nilang puntahan. Second, Thailand, Your Honor, it increased by 7.1% in 2022 alone, soon as they had ratified their treaty. That's about $300 billion US, Mr. President. And these are trade to RCEP countries, Mr. President. These are not trade to other nations, Europe or all. These are trade to RCEP countries. In Cambodia, they went up to 4% in 2022. At $31 billion US, Mr. President. And I'd like to take note, there's an increase of 17.6% in exports in garments alone to Australia, with a total of $102 million US. The other day, nasa inquirer po, $6.5 million trade deal with Japan on garments. Ito po, $102 million on Australia alone because of RCEP. So ang laki compared to what we were getting in other countries, because I presume it is cheaper to produce it within the RCEP family and to export it because of less tariffs. Malaysia, Mr. President, exports grew by 25%. Can you imagine that, Mr. President? 25%. RCEP countries, and in 2022, it accounted for 58% of total trade of Malaysia. And the list goes on, Mr. President. Before you know it, pati Laos, baka matalo pa tayo sa Laos and even Myanmar in terms of trade within these countries. So, my position there, Mr. President, our neighbors are gaining ground and gaining financially from joining this largest, one of the largest trade agreement areas in our region. And there are so many studies here which can go contrary to what the lady has mentioned. Ang dami, this is 2 pages long to go contrary to what the gentle lady has mentioned. But simplifying it is that our neighbors had gained higher exports from joining RCEP since last year.
Yes, so with no desire to argue with our distinguished Senate President, the data provided must be placed in its proper context, because even if indeed Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia manifested increases in their trade, the truth is they can't all be credited to RCEP. It means simply that we are trading more actively with our neighbors here in ASEAN. As an example, China-Philippines bilateral trade increased by 8.3% during the first 11 months of 2022, a clear recovery from the pandemic. We were not members of RCEP, but that uptick was very clear-cut. Philippine exports to South Korea increased by 16.9%, again during the same period of the first 3 quarters of 2022, where in fact both South Korea and China are RCEP members, and still the Philippines was not. In fact, our increase in trade was greater than these examples stated of Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam without RCEP.
But Madam President, just to Mr. President, let's go to the flip side. The flip side is if we don't join RCEP and we stay isolationist in this region, you think the people that we talked to in Japan last weekend with the president, your brother, will they want to go to the Philippines and expand their trade here? They can take it to Vietnam. They can take it to Cambodia. They can take it to other countries that are within the RCEP because it's more advantageous to them. So the flip side there is, okay, because we're afraid that our exports may go down, and therefore let's not join RCEP. The flip side there is all those who want to expand that are already exporting now will just go to an RCEP member country. And I introduced you last week with a company that wants to build 2,000 e-vehicles. It's an EVT company. It's the biggest e-vehicle company listed in the NASDAQ. Their choice is between Singapore, Johor, or the Philippines. Singapore, why? Because the headquarters in Singapore, the manufacturing will be in Johor. And they held on to the contract signing because they wanted to visit the Philippines. And I brought them here last week. Obviously, it would be more advantageous for them to go to Singapore, Johor if we do not join the RCEP. Because they also want to sell these vehicles within the RCEP regions, not only the United States. So the flip side there is that we don't join RCEP, definitely we will not be able to expand the exports. We will not have a hard time convincing these people to come in and do foreign direct investment in our country. That's the long and short of it.
Mr. President, I would like to respond to the chairman of the
Yes.
Foreign Relations Committee.
Before you embark on your explanation,
Yes.
Senate President Pro Tempore, I'm very grateful for you taking over this bill. I have deep and immense gratitude for that.
Thank you so much, and I would like to put on record that I consulted Her Honor before I took on the responsibility when my name was mentioned as subcommittee chair. Well, I was out of the session hall, but I heard my name being mentioned. And as part of the leadership of the chamber, I do not shirk from the responsibility, however challenging. And I asked Your Honor very clearly, Sen Aimee, whom I regard very highly as knowledgeable, having vast experience in governance as well, what is wrong with RCEP convinced me that I should not take it. And Your Honor had told me there is nothing wrong with RCEP. It is smuggling. It is the way there's been lack of support for the agriculture sector and similar issues. And so I accepted it. I said, okay, then I will take on that responsibility to the best of my ability. And then I studied it. But I am grateful for the very clarificatory questions that you are posing, because these are the same questions I asked during the 5-hour hearing and the 7-hour briefing that ensued. Let me just state, Your Honor, that there are many studies on the impact of RCEP, but only the study by Banga shows the negative conclusions. As we mentioned yesterday, there are studies by Dr. Coro Raton of the Virginia Polytechnic Institute, Dr. Kimba of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, and many more. And based on the study of Dr. Coro Raton, there will be an improved trade balance, increased welfare, and lower poverty incidence as early as its entry into force, with significant improvements, hopefully, I hope it happens, by 2031. By that year, Your Honor, poverty incidence will decrease, supposedly based on the study, by 3.62%. Real GDP will increase by 1.93%, and reduction in poverty gap by 3.49%, and reduction in poverty severity by 3.82%. According to Dr. Kimba, there will be a 10.47% increase in exports and 2.02% increase in real GDP. Of course, I agree with you. These are studies, these are statistics, these are numbers. We can listen to Banga, to Kimba, to several experts here, and I feel for you. We share the same advocacies. We've talked about it privately. And yung pangamba nyo, pangamba din po natin. Matutuwa po kayo na meron tayong ginawang bago na innovation and innovation in our concurring resolution, which I will read into the record later, are provisions and resolutory clauses that hopefully everybody, including those who are against the RCEP treaty as is, that will mandate and task our agencies whose cabinet members are present here with us today to work on specific sectors so that whatever possibility of adverse impact on that sector will be buffered by the provisions in our resolutory clauses. So, dininig po natin ang hinaing ng bawat sektor. Gaya ng sinabi natin kapon, this is not a magic pill. 33 agricultural tariff lines, 15 agricultural products. We already have several ASEAN FTAs. We have 2 bilateral FTAs. One is with Australia and New Zealand. The other one is JPEPA, which I also voted in favor, by the way, which was also controversial at the time. There was so much pressure also not to vote for it, but it has shown a positive impact. May I just state, Your Honor, before, I don't know if you were in the Senate in 2018 as chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, this representation sponsored the EFTA. And the EFTA with the non-EU countries, which include Switzerland, had a negative balance of trade or trade deficit with the Philippines. But after 2018, and it was pandemic, now at present, I am told that there is a positive balance of trade or a trade surplus on account of our export of electric fans and vacuum cleaners made in Laguna to Switzerland. And therefore, there's a trade surplus with the EFTA countries. I wanted, just like you, to be convinced that this FTA we are entering into or concurring into will be beneficial to our country. Pero, aaminin ko po, yung agam-agam ninyo, malaking parte pa rin nandyan sa akin. But we cannot be left behind, as the Senate President so clearly mentioned, because of all the ASEAN nations, we are the only country, Mr. President, who has not ratified this. And as I mentioned yesterday, pag merong nag-export ng tsokolate mula sa Indonesia, mula sa nagtatanim ng kakao, at binabana ng Japan ang taripa dahil RCEP country siya, paano na yung ating mga gustong mag-export ng tsokolate, base na rin sa local kakao natin, kung hindi tayo sasama ng RCEP dahil zero na ang taripa within 16 years, pag RCEP country ka, pag hindi, ay malaki, 24.3%, 23% ang taripa. Bibilin ba ng mga Hapon ang tsokolate mula Indonesia o ang tsokolate galing Pilipinas? Base na rin sa cacao farmers sa Mindanao, sa iba-ibang lugar, kung hindi ganung kababa ang presyo. Isang pahayag lang po yan. Sabi nga ni Senator, wag nang mahaba ang mga sagot ko, kaya lang ko pag kay Senator Marcos dahil sinanggunik ko siya bago tanggapin ko ang aking tungkulin sa trabahong ito na hindi madali. Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes, respectful of the deadlines imposed upon this House as well as on the Senate President, may I just raise the following questions by way of manifestation that the sponsors may or may not answer. We are repeatedly told everywhere we go that we are the last country to ratify this trade agreement, this treaty. However, the reality is, at the outset, a major economy refused to even join the discussion. Is it not a fact that India did not join RCEP precisely because of concerns similar to ours here in the Philippines on threats of circumvention of rules of origin, issues of trade deficit, and the potential flood of imported goods? We share the same problems with India, except they're much bigger and they're much stronger. And what about that growing trade deficit? Not projected, but actually recorded already in several countries. This is a major concern po. I would also like to mention that a statement was made by the sponsors that adequate safety nets are provided in the agreement to cover unwarranted or exceptional circumstances. May I simply say that these supposedly sufficient safeguards are no safeguards at all, simply because the success rate for successfully defending Article 20 of the GATT and the Article 14 of the GATS, the Services Agreement, is less than 3%. A study in 2015 reveals that out of 43 cases involving Article 20 of GATT and Article 14 of GATS, only one was successful. Wala naman dyan nananalo eh. Kaya itong mga emergency measures na sinasabi, parang palamuti na lang at parang consuelo de bobo, pagkat hindi naman nagagamit, hindi naman napapanalunan. Ito nga ang kinatatakutan natin. Meron tayong Senate resolution on the concurrence of RCEP, including measures and instructions to government agencies in an attempt to provide additional safety nets to the vulnerable sectors, particularly the agricultural sector. Ito nga ang problema. Nakita natin sa rice tariffication law, may fund na sinasabi. Yet studies show that the income of farmers fell by 40%. How do we ensure that the measures indicated will indeed protect the vulnerable sectors? Ito nga ang mga problema natin. May bisa ba talaga itong mga safety nets na to? Ginagamit ba natin ng madalas? At talaga bang may epekto? Yan ang tanong ko. At I would also like to put on record the reported conclusion that there are great potential gains for the Philippine agricultural sector. It is not clear how the sector can capitalize on these potential gains, given the sorry state of agriculture in this country. Presently, we're struggling to provide basic agricultural services that were promised as early as 1994 with the WTO. Hanggang ngayon, in the last 10 years, ang compounded annual growth rate of irrigated areas is only 2%. We cannot deliver the basic services. Do we really believe we can deliver the services necessary to make our farmers capitalize and transform into competitive partners in whatever RCEP has to offer? In addition, a good bulk of the potential exports of Philippine agricultural products will be destined for China. Given the recent moves by our government, which China has specifically already manifested their disappointment with the additional EDCA sites, is it realistic to project that China will be buying all our durians? We're already witness to what has happened in the last few years with the Australia-China trade wars. Is this what we want to happen? And also, realistically, the peak of the fruit bearing for durian is not tomorrow. It's after 10 to 15 years. Our Senate President knows that very well. He comes from Mindanao. And I believe that we should not make these promises simply because we will be fraught to fulfill them. Also, it is claimed that the RCEP will benefit the MSMEs due to a platform called RCEP SME that institutionalizes support and cooperation for them to be integrated in the great global production chain. The truth is, Article 14 of RCEP, the single article pertaining to MSMEs, uses very vague, non-committal words such as encouraging MSMEs, promoting, exploring. By these provisions, are we certain that best practices and trade will in fact be engendered? Is there a sanction? Will they be punished if they don't do this? This is a concern. Lastly, and as I said, I have no desire to torment my peers, most especially my Honorable Senate President, but the proponents of RCEP have stated that joining the trade agreement will result in an increase in electronic exports. But will these reports of electronic exports increases really defray the thousands of jobs already lost in the electronic companies leaving the country due to incentive and other infrastructure concerns. How confident is the DTI at the end of the day that electronic exports will increase due to RCEP, given the reported closures of electronic firms, not only here in Southern Tagalog, but also in MEPSA and other places throughout the country? We are also aware of the loss of jobs everywhere in many of these areas. These are my concerns, and I am grateful to the President, to the majority, for allowing me to put them on record. The sponsors may or may not reply as necessary, but I have to put them on record for the concerned sectors. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I deeply appreciate the points made by our distinguished colleague, Senator Amy Marcos, and just in broad strokes, Mr. President, to just come up with a very short, I'll try to shorten it as possible in the answers. The issue in agriculture, well, first of all, the issue in India. I mentioned yesterday my geopolitical, my geopolitical issue. India and China don't like each other. Actually, they beat each other up every time in the border of India and China. India now is slowly gaining in terms of population. They're actually going to be probably this year the biggest population in the world. They're going to surpass China very, very soon. And so I think they're worried about opening up their markets to China, which is a more sophisticated, has a more sophisticated manufacturing system, which probably they feel in India they cannot compete with, no? Especially with the larger population that's growing in India. They might lose out on these markets. On the issue of agriculture, Mr. President, marami talagang problema ang agrikultura. Marami talaga. From the lack of inputs, the lack of know-how, the lack of training, the lack of modernization of our equipments and machineries, even land concerns. Kasi overlapping po yung issues on land dyan sa agriculture. Napakahirap. Kung gusto po natin, sabihin natin sa San Miguel Corporation, pwede ba kayo magtanim ng 1,000 or 10,000 hectares of land? And I know there was a Brazilian group that went to the president asking for 10,000 hectares of land to present to the president the real modern way of sugar agriculture to include ethanol and biofuels and biomass para 4 products in 1 for sugarcane. Alam niyo po, ang totoo dyan, nandiyan po si ES, nag-usap kami dyan, napakahirap maghanap ng lupa dahil overlapping ang mga may-ari nitong lupang ito. Agrarian Reform Beneficiaries, NCIP communities, talaga napakahirap maghanap ng lupa para magtanim ng farms na yon, lalo na corporate farms. And we're very restrictive when it comes to corporate farms because the agrarian reform law is still in place, and they'd rather give it to beneficiaries rather than our farmers. No, so I mean, other than corporate farming, I just want to put on record: Thailand spends double in their agriculture than Philippines, double. So maybe in the next budget cycle, with the help of Senator Amy, with the help of all of us here, let's double the budget of agriculture and let's make sure that it goes to the right programs. I totally agree with you. And that's the only way to do it. But at least I'd like to point for the record, nandito din sa smuggling issue, nandito si Commissioner Rubio, nandiyan ba? Nandito si Commissioner Rubio to show he's brand new, newly minted, to show that we are going to weigh in heavily on the smugglers and try to apprehend them. So, yun lamang po, Mr. President, on BRICS, I just came out with big strokes. And want to thank again the lady senator from Ilocos Norte for allowing me to shortly try to answer some of the questions that she had asked earlier. Maraming salamat po, Mr. President.
Well mga kababayan, makikita nga natin na tila matindi ang bakbakan sa Senado. Tila makikita natin na ginagawa nga lang lahat ni Senador Amy Marcos para maayos at matulungan ang bansang Pilipinas, lalo na di umano ang mga naghihirap at kawawang mga farmers. Dahil kung iisipin natin, ang pinakamahalagang tao sa buong Pilipinas at lalo sa bansang Pilipinas ay ang mga farmers. Dahil kung wala ang mga farmers, wala tayong mabibili at tila wala ang mabibenta ang mga nagtitinda ng mga gulay at kahit ano paman. Kaya naman, huwag niyong gipitin ang mga farmers dahil kawawa naman sila at tila dapat sila ang bigyan ng karapatan at ng tulong, hindi ang mayayaman. Well, ano sa inyong palagay mga kababayan? Just comment below sa ating comment section ang inyong mga opinion at ating pag-uusapan.